So here's something I never expected to be doing on the coldest night of the year. Standing in my driveway at 6 in the morning, breath fogging up in the frozen air, watching a city code enforcement officer shake his head and laugh while Diane Chambers stood 5 feet away looking like she'd just bitten into a lemon the size of a basketball. Let me back up, because that moment didn't happen in a vacuum. That moment was the product of weeks of nonsense, a blizzard that shut down half the county, a snow removal business I'd built from scratch, and one of the most aggressively petty HOA board members I have ever had the misfortune of living near. And I have lived in this neighborhood for 11 years, so I've had plenty of time to get a real good read on who Diane Chambers is and what she's about. My name is Dan Bennett. I own a house on Crestwood Circle in a planned community called Millbrook Estates. It's a nice enough neighborhood, honestly. Good neighbors, decent upkeep, some genuinely good people. The HOA itself is a mixed bag, and it has been ever since the original board got voted out about 4 years ago, and Diane managed to claw her way onto the board and then essentially take it over from the inside. She holds the vice president title officially, but everyone in the neighborhood knows she runs the show. The actual president, a mild-mannered retired guy named Harold, mostly just nods along with whatever Diane decides and then tries to apologize for it later in private. Now, before all of this happened, I need to tell you about my side business, because it's the whole reason this story exists. About 6 years ago, I started a small snow removal operation. I've got a full-time job in logistics during the day, but every winter I pick up contracts with local businesses, a few commercial parking lots, a church down the road, and a handful of private driveways. I run 2 trucks and I own a medium-sized enclosed trailer that I use to haul my snowblowers, extra salt, fuel cans, shovels, ice scrapers, and all the other gear you need when you're running around at 3 in the morning clearing parking lots during a storm. The trailer is not enormous. It's a 16-foot enclosed cargo trailer, white, with my business name on the side in blue letters, Bennett Snow and Ice Removal. It's registered, it's insured, it has working lights, and it sits on a proper set of trailer tires that I check every fall. I'm not running some rusted junk heap around. This is a legitimate piece of commercial equipment that I maintain well. During the off-season, I keep the trailer stored at a facility about 12 minutes from my house. But during active snow season, I bring it home because I need to be able to hook it up and roll at a moment's notice when a storm hits. That's just the nature of snow removal. When it snows at 2 in the morning, my clients aren't going to wait around while I drive out to a storage unit, back up, hook everything up, and then head out. Time is money in that business, and more than that, time is safety. A commercial parking lot that hasn't been cleared before employees show up is a liability nightmare for whoever owns it. So every year from roughly November through March, that trailer parks in my driveway overnight. My driveway is long enough to fit 3 vehicles, so the trailer isn't blocking the sidewalk. It's not hanging into the street, it's not impeding anybody. It just sits there, attached to my truck, looking like exactly what it is, a work trailer belonging to a guy who runs a snow removal business. I had been parking that trailer in my driveway for 5 winters before Diane Chambers decided she had a problem with it. 5 years. Not a single complaint, not a single letter, not a single word. And then one October, Diane joined a neighborhood Facebook group, started reading through old posts, and apparently decided that she was going to spend the winter on a mission. The first sign was a letter. I got it in late November, right around the time the first real cold front moved in and everyone started watching the weather apps nervously. The letter was on official HOA letterhead, and it informed me that, pursuant to Section 7, Article 4 of the Millbrook Estates Community Standards, commercial vehicles and trailers were not permitted to be stored in driveways visible from the street overnight, and that I needed to make arrangements to move my trailer to an approved storage location within 14 days. I read that letter twice, put it on my kitchen counter, and went online to pull up the actual HOA documents. I had read them when I first moved in, but that was 11 years ago, and I wanted to make sure I was reading the right language. What I found was interesting. The HOA documents did reference commercial vehicles, but the specific language was actually about vehicles that are actively leaking fluids, have flat tires, or are in a state of disrepair. There was also a clause about vehicles that obstruct the roadway or sidewalk. There was nothing in there that said a properly maintained, registered, insured work trailer parked on a private driveway and not blocking any public space was prohibited. Nothing. I also checked the local city ordinances, because I figured if Diane was going to push this, she'd eventually try to involve the city. I wanted to know exactly what the city rules said. What I found was that the city had a parking ordinance that covered street parking, not driveway parking. On private property, the rules were pretty simple. As long as the vehicle or trailer wasn't blocking a sidewalk, wasn't creating a visibility hazard at an intersection, and wasn't sitting abandoned and unregistered, it was generally fine. The city didn't regulate what you could park on your own driveway just because it was a commercial trailer. I wrote back to the HOA. I was polite about it. I explained that I had reviewed the community standards carefully, and I didn't believe my trailer fell under the restrictions they were citing, since it was properly registered, insured, maintained, not in disrepair, and not blocking any sidewalk or roadway. I asked them to provide the specific subsection language that applied and explain how my trailer met that definition. I sent it certified mail so I had proof of delivery, and I kept a copy. That letter apparently annoyed Diane something fierce, because 2 weeks later I ran into my neighbor across the street, a guy named Phil Reyes, who told me that at the last HOA board meeting Diane had spent a solid 15 minutes talking about certain homeowners who feel they're above the rules. Phil is one of the good ones. He's been on the street longer than I have, and he has zero patience for Diane's games. He told me word for word what she said, and then told me that 2 other board members looked genuinely uncomfortable during the whole thing. I thanked Phil, wrote down what he told me, dated it, and added it to the folder I was keeping on this whole situation. I know that sounds a little paranoid, but I've seen enough HOA drama in this neighborhood over the years to know that documentation is everything. If Diane was building a case, I was going to build one too. Now, this all happened in the lead-up to what turned out to be the worst winter the county had seen in about a decade. By mid-December, we'd already had 2 significant snowstorms, and the meteorologists were tracking a major system that was supposed to hit right after Christmas. And sure enough, 2 days after Christmas, it delivered. I'm talking 18 inches of snow overnight, with another 4 to 6 coming down throughout the day. Wind chills in the -20s. Roads that the city plows couldn't keep up with because it was coming down faster than they could clear it. For me personally, that storm was a nightmare in the best possible way. I was out from midnight until well past noon the next day, bouncing between my commercial contracts, doing 3 runs over each lot because the snow kept coming. My guys were running on coffee and hand warmers. The trucks were working hard, the trailer was getting hitched and unhitched as I swapped equipment, and by the time I finally got home that evening I was completely done. I backed the trailer into the driveway, unhooked it, went inside, ate something, and fell asleep on the couch with my boots still half on. Here's where things get good. I woke up the next morning around 6 to my phone buzzing with a text from Phil. It said, and I'm quoting this exactly because I saved it, "Diane is outside right now taking pictures of your trailer. Just FYI." I got up, looked out my front window, and sure enough, there she was. It was still dark, temperature was sitting around 12 degrees, and Diane Chambers was standing on the sidewalk in front of my house in a puffy coat and snow boots with her phone out, photographing my trailer from multiple angles. Now, the sidewalk is public space, so she wasn't doing anything illegal by standing there. but the sight of her out there in the dark and the cold, photographing my trailer after I'd spent the previous 20 hours keeping people's parking lots safe, was one of the most infuriating things I had seen in a long time. I did not go outside. I did not open the window. I went to my kitchen, made coffee, and called my friend Marcus, who is an attorney. Not a real estate attorney specifically, but he's sharp and he knew enough to point me in the right direction. I told him what was going on, and he told me pretty much what I already suspected. The HOA had a weak case if their own documents didn't clearly prohibit what I was doing, and the city would likely have no interest in getting involved in a private driveway dispute. He told me to keep documenting everything, not to move the trailer voluntarily, and to stop responding to HOA letters unless I had a clear legal basis to dispute something specific. He also told me to look into whether the HOA was selectively enforcing their rules, because that could matter a lot. That last part stuck with me. Selective enforcement. I spent the next few days, when I wasn't out dealing with aftermath cleanup from the big storm, driving slowly around Millbrook Estates and looking at driveways. And what I found was illuminating. There were at least 4 other households in the neighborhood that had work-related vehicles or trailers in their driveways during the day or overnight. One guy 2 streets over had a landscaping trailer that he parked in his driveway. A woman on the east side of the community had a cargo van for her cleaning business that she parked in her driveway every single night. A guy around the corner from me had an RV that was parked on his driveway for months at a time. None of them had received letters from the HOA. I drove by each of those properties, noted the addresses, took my own photos with timestamps, and added everything to the folder. Then I did something that I probably should have done years earlier. I pulled the HOA's financials. In most states, HOA financial records are something homeowners have a right to inspect upon request. I submitted a formal written request to review the financial records and board meeting minutes from the past 2 years. I knew that would take some time to get a response on, but I wanted it on the record that I had asked. January came in cold and relentless. We had 2 more storms, smaller than the Christmas blizzard but still significant enough to keep me busy and the trailer in my driveway. I got one more letter from the HOA, more formal in tone this time, stating that I was in continued violation and that if I didn't comply they would pursue fines. I wrote back again, certified mail again, reiterating my position and this time including a list of addresses of other properties in the community where similar vehicles or trailers were regularly parked without any apparent HOA action. I asked Diane in writing to explain why my trailer was receiving attention while these other properties were not. I used the phrase selective enforcement deliberately, and I made sure the letter was addressed to the full board, not just Diane. About a week later, I got the board meeting minutes I had requested. I read through them, and what I found made me genuinely angry. In the minutes from a board meeting in November, before I had even received my first letter, there was a reference to a discussion initiated by Diane Chambers about addressing commercial vehicle storage in driveways. The minutes noted that the board voted 3-2 to send a formal notice to properties in violation. But here's the thing. The minutes only specifically named my property, not the landscaping trailer 2 streets over. Not the cargo van, not the RV, just me. Dan Bennett, 14 Crestwood Circle. So I now had documented proof that the board had specifically targeted my property at Diane's instigation without applying the same scrutiny to comparable situations elsewhere in the community. That's textbook selective enforcement. I called Marcus back and told him what I'd found, and he told me that this actually strengthened my position considerably. He said if they tried to levy fines, I had a very solid basis to challenge them, and if Diane kept pushing, there were avenues to escalate that would not be fun for the HOA. But Diane, God bless her, didn't wait for me to escalate. She decided to call the city herself. I found out later from Phil, who had a source inside the city's code enforcement office, that Diane called the city's non-emergency line and reported that I had a commercial trailer illegally parked on my property in violation of city ordinances. She apparently spent a while on the phone explaining it, citing some ordinance numbers she had looked up, and really pushing for someone to come out and cite me. The city, to their credit, took the complaint and scheduled an inspection. What Diane apparently did not count on was that city code enforcement officers actually read the ordinances before they show up. The morning the officer showed up, it was about 6:15. Still dark, still cold. Temperature was sitting around 9 degrees, and there was about 4 inches of fresh snow on the ground from overnight. I was already awake because I'd been out clearing a lot earlier that morning and had just gotten back about an hour before. I heard a vehicle pull up outside and looked out the window to see a city code enforcement truck parked on the street. And I'll be darned if Diane's car wasn't also parked just down the street, with her sitting in it. She had literally shown up to watch. I put on my coat and boots and went outside. The officer's name was Gary Kowalski, and he introduced himself and explained that he was there in response to a complaint about a commercial trailer parked on the property. He was completely professional and friendly, not aggressive at all. He had a clipboard. He walked around the trailer, looked at the registration sticker, looked at the lights, looked at the tires, checked whether it was encroaching on the sidewalk, and then he stood there for a moment writing some notes. I told him I had anticipated this visit and had pulled the relevant city ordinances, and asked if he minded if I shared what I'd found. He said he was happy to hear it. I pulled out my phone and read him the specific ordinance language about private property parking, the part that established the conditions under which a vehicle could be cited, which were essentially unregistered, obstructing a public right-of-way, creating a safety hazard, or in a state of disrepair that posed a nuisance. I then walked him around the trailer myself and pointed out that it was registered. It had current plates. Its tires were inflated and in good condition. It was sitting well back from the sidewalk edge, and it was clearly operational and actively in use. Officer Kowalski nodded along, made some more notes, and then said, and I will treasure this sentence for the rest of my natural life. Yeah, this isn't a violation of any city ordinance I can see. Whoever called this in had a different expectation of what the city's authority covers. At that moment, I glanced over toward the street, and I could see Diane had gotten out of her car. She was standing in the street in the cold, and she had started walking toward us. I don't know what she thought was going to happen. Maybe she thought she was going to explain the situation more thoroughly to Officer Kowalski, and he was going to suddenly see things her way. She introduced herself as Diane Chambers, Vice President of the Millbrook Estates HOA, and she launched into her explanation. She talked about the community standards, the aesthetics of the neighborhood property values, the impact of commercial equipment being stored on residential driveways, and she was quite passionate about all of it. Officer Kowalski listened politely, and then he explained to her calmly and clearly that city code enforcement does not enforce HOA bylaws, that his authority was limited to city ordinances, that the city's ordinances did not prohibit a registered, maintained trailer from being parked on a private driveway, that there was no violation here and he would not be issuing any citation. Diane tried to push back. She mentioned the ordinance number she had cited when she called in the complaint. Officer Kowalski actually chuckled a little at this, not meanly, just in the way a guy chuckles when someone has clearly misread something they looked up online. He explained that the ordinances she was referencing applied to vehicles parked on public streets for extended periods, not to vehicles on private property. He suggested she consult the HOA's own legal counsel if she wanted to pursue enforcement through the HOA. Diane stood there in 9-degree weather looking like she had expected a very different outcome to this morning. Her cheeks were red, which might have been the cold or might have been something else. She did not say thank you. She turned around, walked back to her car, got in, and drove away. Officer Kowalski turned to me, shook his head with a slight smile, and said, "You have a good day, Mr. Bennett. Sorry for the trouble." He gave me his card in case I had any questions, got back in his truck, and left. I stood in my driveway for a moment in the cold, watching his truck turn the corner. Then I went back inside, made myself another cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen counter with that big happy feeling you get when something unfolds exactly the way you hoped it would. But here's the thing. I was under no illusion that this was over. Diane didn't operate on logic or shame. She operated on persistence and bureaucratic leverage. Getting told off by a city code officer wasn't going to stop her. It was going to make her more determined and more creative. I knew that, so I didn't celebrate too long. Instead, I got back to work. Over the next couple of weeks, I did a few things. First, I made absolutely sure my documentation was airtight. I had the board meeting minutes. I had my certified mail letters and their responses. I had my photos of the other properties with similar vehicles in their driveways. I had the city's non-citation on record because I had followed up with Officer Kowalski and gotten written confirmation by email that no violation had been found. I printed all of it and organized it in a binder. Second, I started talking to my neighbors, not in a gossip-mongering way, but genuinely. I talked to Phil. I talked to the couple next door to me. I talked to a few other people on the street who I knew had their own history of friction with Diane or the HOA. What I found was that I was far from the only person who had a story. One couple, the Garcias on the south end of the circle, had gotten a fine for a decorative holiday wreath that Diane had personally decided violated the community aesthetic standards. They'd paid it because they didn't know they could fight it, and they were still quietly furious about it. Another guy, a man named Ted Larson who had lived in the community even longer than Phil, told me that Diane had tried to get him cited for a basketball hoop in his driveway, which was specifically exempted by their own rules. He'd pushed back and she dropped it, but the attempt had soured him on the entire HOA governance structure. These weren't isolated incidents. There was a pattern here, and the pattern was clear. Diane Chambers used her position on the HOA board to target people she had personal issues with, to push rules selectively based on who she liked and who she didn't, and to leverage the HOA's administrative machinery as a tool for neighborhood control that had nothing to do with actually protecting the community or maintaining property values. The more I talked to people, the more I realized there was enough here to actually challenge the HOA governance at the next annual meeting, which was coming up in late February. Annual meetings were where board elections happened. If enough homeowners showed up and voted, we could restructure the board. I'm not naturally a political guy, but I could see that letting this continue wasn't going to make things better for anybody. So I started, quietly and without making a big announcement, talking to people about whether they'd consider attending the annual meeting and whether there were any homeowners who might want to run for board positions. I was careful not to position it as a mob action or a hate campaign against Diane specifically. I framed it around wanting a board that enforced rules fairly and consistently, and that treated homeowners as adults rather than subjects. Most people responded well to that framing. Even people who didn't have a specific grievance against Diane could see the logic in wanting fair and transparent governance. Meanwhile, January wore on and the weather stayed brutal. We had another storm in the third week of January, a quick 6-inch overnight situation that kept me busy until mid-morning. My trailer was in my driveway every night, as it had been all winter, and I was not moving it. Not for Diane, not for the HOA, not for anyone. The HOA sent me a formal fine notice in late January. $250 for continued violation of community standards regarding commercial vehicle storage. I read the letter, put it in my binder, and immediately drafted a formal dispute. The dispute laid out everything, the actual language of the community standards, and why my trailer didn't meet the definition of a violation, the documented evidence of selective enforcement against my property while comparable situations elsewhere in the community went unchallenged, and the fact that the city itself had inspected the property and found no violation. I sent it certified mail to the board, and I also hand-delivered a copy to Harold, the board president, at his house. Harold looked uncomfortable when I showed up at his door. He's a decent guy, genuinely. He accepted the papers, and I could tell from the look on his face that he had not been fully briefed on everything that had happened. I gave him a brief summary, not angry, just factual. I told him I wasn't going to pay an unjust fine, that I had the documentation to back up my position, and that I was hopeful the board would make the right call when they reviewed the dispute. He thanked me and I left. I later heard from Phil that after I dropped off those papers, Harold had called a special informal meeting with the 2 board members who had voted against the initial action back in November. That was interesting. It suggested there was some internal disagreement on the board that Diane might not be fully controlling anymore. February arrived with a brief warm spell that melted a good chunk of the accumulated snow, which was nice for about 4 days, and then a cold front came back through and turned everything to ice. Ice is in some ways worse than snow because you can clear snow. Black ice on a parking lot is its own special nightmare, and I spent a significant chunk of February pre-salting and re-salting my commercial contracts to stay ahead of the freeze-thaw cycle. The trailer was still in my driveway. I had heard nothing from the HOA about my dispute. The 14-day window for them to respond had come and gone. Under the HOA's own rules, which I had now read in their entirety, if a fine dispute was not responded to within a reasonable time, it was generally considered tabled pending further review. Marcus confirmed this was meaningful and told me I should send a follow-up letter noting that the deadline had passed without a response. I sent that letter. Again, certified mail. About a week before the annual meeting, something happened that I hadn't expected. I got a call from an unknown local number, and when I picked up it was a woman named Sandra Cho who introduced herself as one of the other board members. She was one of the 2 who had apparently been part of Harold's informal meeting. She was professional and a little nervous sounding, and she explained that she had reviewed my dispute documentation, and she believed the fine had been improperly levied. She said she couldn't speak for the full board, but she wanted me to know that she personally was going to advocate for withdrawing the fine at the next board meeting. I thanked her genuinely. I told her I appreciated her taking the time to actually review the documents. We talked for about 10 minutes, and by the end I had a clearer picture of what had been happening inside the board. Sandra told me that Diane had been essentially steamrolling discussions, presenting information selectively, and using procedural tricks to push through actions before all board members had time to review them. She said the board meeting where the decision was made to send fine notices to my property specifically had been rushed, with Diane bringing it up at the end of a long agenda when people were tired and just wanting to go home. That was useful information. It told me that Diane's behavior wasn't just a problem for the homeowners she targeted. It was a problem for the board members who were supposed to be her colleagues. The annual meeting was held on a Thursday evening in late February in the community center building, which was a small room attached to the neighborhood's shared amenity space. It seated maybe 60 people, and when I arrived that evening, I was honestly surprised to see how many people had shown up. The room was full, and there were people standing along the walls. Phil had done his own outreach, and so had the Garcias, and so had Ted Larson. Word had spread that there was going to be something worth showing up for. Diane was there, sitting at the board table in the front of the room with Harold and the other board members. She looked completely normal, maybe even confident, which told me she either hadn't figured out what was coming or she had and was putting on a front. Harold opened the meeting, went through the standard agenda items, and then they got to the board election portion. Diane's seat was up for re-election. Under the HOA bylaws, board members served 2-year terms and any homeowner in good standing could be nominated from the floor. 3 people put themselves forward as candidates for Diane's seat. One was a retired contractor named Alan who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years. One was Sandra Cho, who was technically already on the board but whose seat wasn't up, but who was publicly declaring her intent to run in the next cycle and was supporting the candidates for this one. The third was a young woman named Claire Whitmore who had moved in about 2 years ago and had an extensive background in property management. The vote was conducted by secret ballot and counted by 2 homeowners who volunteered as independent counters, which Harold agreed to because enough people in the room clearly wanted a transparent count. While the votes were being counted, I stood up and asked to speak to the board about the pending fine dispute and the selective enforcement documentation I had submitted. Diane tried to object. She said the fine dispute wasn't on the agenda for this meeting and that it should be handled through the normal administrative process. I pointed out, politely but clearly, that the administrative process required a response within a specified window, that the window had passed without a response, and that I was simply informing the full membership of the situation, since they had a right to know how their HOA funds and administrative actions were being managed. A few people in the room asked me to go ahead. Harold nodded. I kept it brief and factual. I explained the situation with the trailer, the letters, the city complaint, the city's finding of no violation, and the fine that had been levied without following the HOA's own procedural requirements. I mentioned the selective enforcement, and I said I had photos of the other properties if anyone wanted to see them. I did not editorialize. I did not call Diane names or characterize her motivations. I just laid out the sequence of events and let people draw their own conclusions. The room was quiet in that way rooms get when people are paying close attention. Then a few hands went up and people started sharing their own experiences. The Garcias talked about the wreath fine. Ted talked about the basketball hoop. A woman named Karen, not that Karen but a different one, talked about being cited for a flower pot color that Diane had decided was non-compliant, which she had eventually gotten reversed after submitting a 3-page written appeal. Another guy talked about getting a letter about his fence stain, which was the exact same color it had been for 8 years before Diane joined the board. By the time the vote results came in, the room had heard enough. The vote wasn't even close. Alan was elected to the board seat by a margin that Harold announced with a slight look of relief on his face, and Diane officially lost her position on the board. Diane sat very still when the results were read. She didn't say anything. She didn't storm out. She just sat there with a controlled expression that I recognized as someone who is furious but has decided not to show it in public. The meeting wrapped up with some other routine business, and then people started filing out and milling around the way they do after a community meeting when there's something to talk about. I made a point of going up to Harold and thanking him for conducting a fair meeting. He shook my hand and quietly told me that he was going to recommend to the new board that my fine be formally withdrawn at their first official meeting. He also mentioned that he personally thought the whole situation had been handled poorly, and that he was sorry he hadn't pushed back harder earlier. I told him I appreciated that. I also made a point of talking to Sandra and to Alan and to Claire, all 3 of whom seemed energized and ready to actually run the HOA the way it was supposed to be run, as a service to the community rather than a power base for whoever was loudest on the board. Diane left without speaking to me. I didn't try to speak to her either. There was nothing useful to say. She had overplayed her hand at every turn, and the community had responded accordingly. Now, you might be wondering whether it all ended there, whether Diane just quietly accepted the outcome and life went back to normal. And I want to be honest with you, because reality is messier than a story where everything ties up in a neat bow. But what actually happened was close enough to satisfying that I'm not going to complain. A couple of weeks after the annual meeting, the new board met for the first time. Harold was still president, which was fine because Harold was never really the problem. Alan came on in Diane's old seat. Sandra retained her position. The other two existing board members, who had been more or less along for the ride, seemed energized by the change in dynamic. The board voted unanimously to withdraw the fine they had levied against me. They also voted to initiate a formal review of all fine and citation actions taken over the previous 2 years to ensure that they had followed proper procedural requirements and that enforcement had been applied consistently. This was exactly the kind of accountability action that Diane's board never would have taken. The review turned out to be interesting. Over those 2 years, most of the fines issued in the community had been directed at 6 properties. 5 of those 6 properties belonged to people who had previously had some kind of friction with Diane. The 6th was a guy who had genuinely violated a rule, but had never been given the proper notice and opportunity to remedy that the HOA's own documents required. The new board sent letters to all 6 homeowners acknowledging that their fines were being reviewed and offering refunds or credits where the process had been flawed. The Garcias got their wreath fine refunded. That was a small amount of money, but a large amount of satisfaction. The new board also clarified the vehicle and trailer rules in writing, issuing a formal interpretation document that was sent to all homeowners. The interpretation made clear that registered, maintained work vehicles and trailers parked on private driveways were not prohibited by the community standards, provided they were not obstructing public rights of way or in a state of obvious disrepair. That document essentially put my situation on record as compliant, which meant that even if Diane somehow found her way back onto the board in the future, she couldn't restart the same campaign without the board being on record in opposition. March came, and the weather finally started to soften. We had one late storm in the first week of March, a sneaky 6-inch overnight event that caught a few people off guard, and I was out clearing lots again. But by mid-March the nights were staying above freezing, and I knew the season was winding down. On a Saturday morning toward the end of March, I hitched my trailer up to the truck for the last time that winter, drove it out to the storage facility, unhitched it, and left it there until November. Standing in the storage facility parking lot watching the trailer get rolled into its spot, I thought about what a completely bizarre and exhausting winter it had been. I had spent probably 30 hours total on HOA-related stuff during a season where I was also working crazy hours running my snow removal business. I had written letters, researched ordinances, driven around taking photos, attended meetings, had phone calls with attorneys, organized neighbors, and stood in 9-degree weather talking to a code enforcement officer while an HOA board member watched from her car. But here's the thing. I was also glad it had happened. Not the harassment itself, obviously, but the response to it. Because what came out of it was a neighborhood that was more connected than it had been, with people who had discovered they shared grievances and were willing to show up and do something about it. The annual meeting had drawn more attendance than any meeting in Millbrook Estates history, according to Harold. People who had been quietly stewing about HOA issues for years had finally had a reason to engage, and that engagement had produced a genuine change in how the community was being governed. Phil and I got into the habit of having coffee on Sunday mornings, rotating between our houses, and talking about the neighborhood and whatever else was going on. He told me once, about a month after the annual meeting, that he hadn't felt this good about the community in years, that there was a different energy on the street since things had changed. I think he was right. I noticed it too. People were friendlier at the mailboxes, more waves from cars, the kind of small social warmth that tends to disappear when people feel like they're living under surveillance. As for Diane, she stayed in the neighborhood. Selling and moving is a lot of work, and people don't do it just because they lost a board election. I saw her occasionally. We didn't speak. I didn't go out of my way to avoid her, but I didn't go out of my way to engage either. She had lost her platform and the community had moved on, and honestly that was enough. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need her to publicly admit anything. The outcome itself was the resolution. There was one more thing, though, and I want to tell you about it because it was genuinely the most satisfying postscript to this whole saga. About 6 weeks after the annual meeting, I was at the city hall for an unrelated errand, something about a permit for a small deck I wanted to add to the back of my house. While I was waiting, I ran into Officer Kowalski in the hallway. He recognized me immediately, because apparently the story of my driveway visit had made the rounds at code enforcement as an example of an HOA trying to use city resources to handle a private dispute. He told me that after that visit, his supervisor had sent a memo to the department reminding everyone that they were not the enforcement arm of HOA boards, and that complaints about private property parking needed to be carefully evaluated against actual city ordinances before any action was taken. Apparently, my situation had prompted a small policy clarification. I thanked him for handling it professionally that morning. He told me it was easy to be professional when someone had actually done their homework. He said most of the time people either don't know the rules at all or they know them better than the people complaining about them. And in my case, it was clearly the latter. I thought about that on the drive home. Knowing the rules. That's really what the whole thing came down to. Diane had assumed she could weaponize bureaucracy against me because most people don't actually read the documents. They don't read the HOA bylaws. They don't read the city ordinances. They don't know what the rules actually say versus what they've been told the rules say. And that information asymmetry is exactly what people like Diane rely on. The moment you actually read the documents, pull the records, write the certified letters, and show up to the meetings with organized evidence, the power dynamic shifts completely. It's not magic. It's just effort and attention. If there's any advice I'd give to anyone dealing with a similar situation, it's exactly that. Read everything. Document everything. Never respond emotionally when you can respond with evidence. Know the difference between what the HOA's rules actually say and what the HOA is telling you they say. Know the difference between what the city's ordinances actually cover and what someone who's been on a complaint line is claiming they cover. And talk to your neighbors, because you are almost certainly not the only one. The snow removal business had a great winter, by the way. Financially, it was one of my best years, partly because of how heavy the storms were, and partly because I had picked up a couple of new commercial contracts in the fall. The trailer held up well all season. My equipment was in good shape. I had 0 complaints from my clients, and several of them renewed their contracts early, which is always a good sign. When I brought the trailer back home in late October the following fall, getting it ready for another season, I parked it in my driveway, looked at it sitting there next to my truck, and felt nothing but easy satisfaction. That trailer was going to be there all winter, same as it had been for 6 winters before, and it was going to be there without a single letter from the HOA or a single phone call to the city, because the rules were clear and the community knew it. My driveway, my trailer, my registration, my insurance. Every box checked, every rule followed, every challenge met with documentation and calm persistence. The snow started falling that November a couple weeks after I brought the trailer home. A light first-of-season dusting, the kind that doesn't need clearing but makes everything look clean and quiet for a few hours before the plows and the traffic turn it to gray slush. I stood on my front porch with a cup of coffee and watched it come down, and I thought about what a difference a year makes. The street looked good. Phil's house across the way had lights in the windows. The Garcias had a new wreath on their door, bright red, hung exactly wherever they wanted to hang it. Ted Larson's basketball hoop was standing in his driveway like it owned the place. The neighborhood was, for the first time in a while, just a neighborhood. A place where people lived and did their thing and trusted that nobody with a clipboard and a bad attitude was going to show up in the dark to photograph their driveways. That feeling, as it turns out, is worth every hour of documentation. The winter stretched out ahead, cold and full of work and early mornings and frozen fingers, And all the things I love about this ridiculous seasonal business I run out of my driveway. And every single morning I backed that truck up to the trailer, hitched it up, and headed out into the dark and the cold. I did it knowing that the HOA had tried to take that from me and had gotten exactly nowhere. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in that. The kind that doesn't fade by spring.